savage, and this was an ISIS claimed attack. In this case, though, it was more interesting because there was an exchange on Fox News one of the nights of that week. I think it was Palm Sunday when the attack occurred. And Tucker Carlson was interviewing Piers Morgan, the British TV host, who had been on CNN and has had a long career in British media as a broadsheet newspaper editor. And what was interesting is I didn't know that Piers Morgan was a Catholic, but he came on and he really took the Christian church to task for not defending Christians who are being persecuted. And he sort of made the point that it's almost like we feel like we can defend all sorts of other people, but it's like, it's not cricket for us to defend Christians. There's something that's like not quite up to snuff if you're defending your own. And I think one of the things that when you look at the Bible, and in the New Testament in particular, Paul was very concerned about Christians taking care of persecuted Christians and Christians who are in a bad way in various kinds of circumstances in life. And these are issues that Mr. Sputo will be talking about. I just raise it, and so it's in a way it's kind of perfect for him to arrive at this time. I didn't have any idea that this talk sort of occurred on the schedule, and I was thinking this is just because of providential, because I've been thinking a lot about this and what the Christian church response should be to this growing wave of persecution. In fact, it's almost an extermination of Christianity from countries where you'd had 1,000-year, 1,500-year, established churches like in Iraq, where, these are some of the oldest churches in the world. We sort of tend to forget about this because in the 7th century, the Muslims took over those countries, and we don't sort of look at those churches in the same sort of predominant way that they were. But these were very, very important churches in the history of Christianity, and they're just being systematically eradicated. And this is not the only place in the world where this is going on, and he's going to talk about a major country where there is a lot of a huge increase in Christian persecution. Mr. Sputo is the founder of Mute No More. It's an organization that is dedicated to encourage and equip American Christians to love one another by praying, advocating, and providing relief for persecuted Christians in foreign countries. He lives in Orlando, Florida, and has had various roles with the National Christian Foundation, the board of directors of that, and was a pastor at Lakeshore Bible Church in Tampa, Florida, prior to founding Mute No More. So with all that said, and maybe too much said, why don't we have a good warm welcome to Mr. Sputo, and here's a copy of the book. Very bright tomatoey color, as he will explain, I think, if that's where he's going to go. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be here at FRC, and I look forward to sharing with you more about my latest book. And in talking about my latest book, wrong book. I'm sorry. I will be sharing with you also a little bit about Mein Kampf. As I talk about my book and I talk about trends in persecution, I want to share with you an update on some alarming trends in persecution and politics in India and some of the reasons why Mein Kampf has actually been a bestseller in India in recent years. But before I do that, take a step back and join me. Just consider Hebrews 13:3, where the Lord has told us to remember those who are in prison and affliction as though with them. I find this to be one of the more difficult commandments to obey. Not just because I'm ADD, but to remember them as though with them is a challenge. But at the same time, some of my greatest blessings have come at times when I did remember the persecuted. Persecution is the cross, and it's grievous even when we see the cross from a perspective of suffering and death. But just like the cross, there's another side that's glorious where we see the resurrected Lord. And similarly, Jesus is alive, and perhaps nowhere else on earth is he more visibly alive than in the persecuted church. God shows up in the persecuted church in ways that oftentimes or rarely we get to see in the West. When I started on the journey that I'm going to share with you today, I read a book written by a pastor in the underground church in China. And the miracles I read about left me astounded, to the point where I had to call a friend who was familiar with the underground church in China and ask him if these things were true. And then I had to pray. And I had to ask the Lord to forgive me, because somewhere in my subconscious, I had put God in a box and said, oh, that's how God worked in the first century, and that's not how he's working today. And that's just not the case. And so, fast forward, I am here today, just returned from Brazil, where I attended the Religious Liberty Partnership meeting, annual meeting. The Religious Liberty Partnership, RLP, is an association of Christian organizations from 24 different countries that meet annually to share and discuss data, strategy, projects, and collaboration on how to help the persecuted church. And while there, we have an opportunity to hear from some phenomenal speakers. One of our speakers was Russell Stendhal, and I had actually had opportunity to have dinner with Russell. Anybody here know Russell? So Russell is the American missionary in Colombia. He was kidnapped by Colombian drug warlords 5 different times. He was kidnapped by men who had slaughtered hundreds of pastors, but each time God saved his life. And at dinner, he shared with me, looking back, it's obvious God was just using me as the bait. But in that process of just suffering and death in the Christian church, God used Russell to save many of the drug warlords and to save many that were in the Colombian army, to the extent that you may hear now on the news that there's some peace negotiations going on between them, but in the mainstream news you won't hear that it's because many of them got saved and they realized they couldn't walk with God any longer and sell drugs and kill each other. They met in Cuba as a neutral place to begin the peace discussions, and they stopped and they realized we can't do this without Russell. And so they waited. They called Russell to come to Cuba from Colombia. Russell got all the necessary approvals, took him a little while, arrived, and he asked a 91-year-old man named Albert to join him. Albert has the gift of healing. Albert arrived, and Russell said, now when we get there, there's 2 of these guys that are crippled and maimed from war, and I want you to pray that God will heal them. And Albert said, I don't think I can do that. I've spent most of my life praying for the Christians that these men have been trying to kill. And Russell said to him, Albert, who healed them? You or God? Albert lowered his head, God. Russell said, why don't you just pray and leave it up to God whether or not he wants to heal them? And one by one, Albert came in the room. One particular guerrilla drug warlord had a leg that was shriveled up and maimed from a bomb blast. And Albert prayed for him, and in front of their eyes, God restored his leg. Another had a twisted and contorted spine and a back full of shrapnel. Albert prayed for him, and God healed him. It's just amazing what God was doing in Colombia, but through some atrocities that just grieve you. There's actually a movie written about this story, and it's on YouTube. It's called La Montaña, spelt like Montana. And there are already over 2 million views. I'd encourage you to see it. One of the other speakers that I had the opportunity to meet, a lawyer, I'm going to refer to her as Maria, although that's not her real name. Maria grew up in an Islamic country where people who were very close to her were murdered for their faith. Maria went on to become an attorney, and last year she was in Kurdistan, Iraq, and she was ministering to the refugees, and she met a young teenage girl who was ready to take her life. She was distraught. She had seen her father and her brothers murdered before she was kidnapped, imprisoned, and raped by many men over many months before she escaped. Maria consoled her and shared with her her own loss as she was growing up. And Maria told her, look at me, and God still worked for the good. And God wants to work for the good through you. She consoled her and convinced her to take a video, to allow her to video the girl giving her testimony. Not long after, Maria was back in London. She's sitting, as she would say, at a sidewalk cafe overlooking a square, and there was a protest going on in the square. And she felt the Lord prompt her to get up and go and see what they were protesting about. But she was tired, and she didn't get up. She felt prompted a second time, but she didn't get up. She felt prompted a third time, and she said, Lord, do you want me to get up and go over there? I'm glad I'm not the only one that's slow. And just about time she said, do you want me to go over there? An American woman came up to her and said, excuse me, you've been sitting here long enough and I'm tired. Would you get up, please? So she got up and walked across the square. She approached the man who appeared to be leading the protest and inquired why they were protesting. And he told her it was because Parliament had just voted to not declare ISIS crimes genocide because of insufficient evidence. She told him her story, gave him her card. He called her later that day and asked her to come to a TV studio that night for one of the Brits' popular late-night TV shows and give her story. She did. And as only God would have it, a chief of staff for a leading parliamentarian saw it, called her the next morning and said, would you please come tomorrow and testify, and I'm going to call for a revote. She immediately called a friend of hers who was on a mission trip in Syria and had similar testimonies and said, can you get here in 8 hours? Now, logistically and legally, without a plan in place already, to get from Syria to London is probably virtually impossible. But she arrived just in time to testify in Parliament. And as they testified, Maria shared the young girl's video. And she shared the young girl's video, and the girl testified now to the world of how her father and brother were killed, of how she and every other girl in her community over the age of 8 years old were imprisoned and raped. In the video, she spoke of witnessing her friends being raped, of hearing their screams, of seeing a 9-year-old girl raped by so many men until she died. And then her friend, who had just come from Syria, testified. And she had similar testimonies of Christians being killed and tortured, of children being beheaded in front of their parents, of mothers seeing their children crucified. Based on their testimonies, Parliament voted that day unanimously to condemn the Islamic State for genocide and to refer the issue to the UN Security Council. It's just, God works in amazing ways. A young lawyer on a mission trip. Remembering the persecuted challenges us and it convicts us. In my own experience, I traveled to a country that was hostile to the gospel and had the opportunity to spend a day with a brother, a courageous brother, who just a couple weeks before I arrived was preaching the gospel in a large area, and he was attacked by men with machine guns and left for dead. The Lord miraculously healed him. And guess what he was doing when I arrived? Preaching the gospel in the same area. I was more than a little nervous to hang out with him that day. I had dinner with him and his family that night, and I saw a side of the normal Christian life that I'd never seen before. I came home reading Revelation chapter 3, the church of Laodicea, and the Lord said, Dominic, you're lukewarm. And I reflected back on my trip, and I saw what hot was, and it wasn't me. Praise God, he's patient, he's merciful, and I'm still a work in process. And so as I share with you really more of part of my story in Heirloom Love and me being a work in process, I grew up in a family that never went to church, never had a Bible, never heard the gospel until I was 28 years old, and by the grace of God, he revealed his son to me, and I believed. As a new believer, one of the great convictions was how compassionate and kind God is. And you remember when the religious leaders came to Jesus, right? And they said, what must we do to be saved? And he said, love the Lord your God, heart, soul, mind, and strength, love neighbor as yourself. And of course they said, well, who's my neighbor? And he gave us the parable of the Good Samaritan. And then he wrapped it up by saying, so who was his neighbor? And they said, the one who showed compassion. And then what did Jesus say? He said, go and do the same. I was so convicted that I made a vow. And I made a vow, and I said, Lord, if you ever increase my income, I'm not going to increase my spending. I'm going to use your income to represent your compassion to the world. When I made that vow, I was living with my wife on a modest standard of living in a modest home and more than modestly happy. I didn't know, though, that the Lord was going to lead me in less than 6 months to start a software company that just 2 years later would go public on NASDAQ at the height of the tech boom. Remember, I'm a work in process. I turned my back on that vow. I gave 10% to our local church. I gave another 10% to charity, probably not out of a whole lot of compassion, but more trying to appease my conscience. But then life became all about me, and I started living large. One of the first things I did, my wife wasn't for it, so I say I did, was I built a large waterfront home that was 5 times larger than the home we were living in when I made that vow. We moved in that house, and just less than a couple months later, I was on a church camping trip and got bit by a tick and contracted Lyme disease. And even though we caught it within the first 2 weeks, didn't respond to antibiotics, I started seeing a guy in Connecticut. I was living in Florida, but he was supposedly the best guy for Lyme in Connecticut. And it wasn't long before he told me, you have a unique strain of Lyme disease that's not going to respond to antibiotics. We'll keep trying. And inside of 18 months, I was ready to die. It was in my brain to the point where I couldn't complete sentences or hold a conversation. It was in my organs. I had complications from excessive antibiotics, including a home health nurse that came in with some intravenous antibiotic cocktails. I had fungus growing on my nails. I had fungus growing in my mouth from the antibiotics. I had these strange red bumps that looked like pencil erasers all over my head and neck that never went away. And I'm a relatively trim frame person anyway, but I weighed 45 pounds less than I do today. And doctors couldn't help me anymore, wasn't seeing any physicians, and thought my days were coming to an end. And it was to the point where my wife and my mother would look at me and go in the other room and start weeping. And then on October 12th, 2002, a dear brother in the church called me. He was trembling as he said, God told me to call you and tell you he's going to heal you. And when we hung up the phone, every symptom left my body. Now, you have to understand, I was a walking basket case. Anybody could look at me and tell that I was at the end. I was a member of a very large 10,000-member megachurch at the time, and I went to church the next day on Sunday. And you could have heard a pin drop. I didn't have to say a word. People knew. It wasn't long after that I knew the Lord was leading me to create a stewardship plan for my life. And I started with a cover-to-cover study of Scripture. And in the New Testament, I counted 426 verses that pertain to money and giving. Of those verses, by the way, the story I'm telling you, the verses, and even a list of all the Scriptures is included in here. Of those 426 verses, 66% of them pertain to using resources to help suffering and persecuted members of the household of faith. 21% pertain to helping the poor in general without reference to their faith. And 13% pertain to supporting pastors, missionaries, and workers of the gospel. So based on that, I started looking for opportunities to support the persecuted church. I ended up contacting the leaders, talking to the leaders of the 20 largest denominations and the 150 largest churches in the U.S. 2 of those denominations and 2 of those churches had programs and budgets to serve the persecuted church. The others did not. I was surprised, but in hindsight, I shouldn't have been. I want to reframe that. I was surprised, but as I looked at the process where the Lord had taken me through, perhaps I shouldn't have been. I went back and looked at those scriptures and came to understand that all of my Christian walk, I had read the scriptures from the New Testament from a Western perspective with lenses that were probably tinted by comfort and security. But the New Testament was written in the blood and the tears of the persecuted, where suffering and loss was the normal Christian life. And so I started sharing with friends what I had learned, and eventually it evolved into the book Heirloom Love, which is it's a study of the New Testament from a persecuted context perspective. And so, because there's a lot in here that until we purpose to look at it through the original context, that we're apt to miss. So, for example, take the New Testament teaching on hospitality. My natural inclination is I'm going to have friends over for lunch after church. But the New Testament context was to provide food, covering, and care for Christian refugees. And there's probably never been a time where that's been more relevant. Just in Nigeria, there are an estimated 40,000 people that have, mostly Christians, been killed by Islamists, and over 1 million more that have been driven from their homes that are refugees. In the Middle East, Syria and Iraq, Islamic State has driven several million Christians from their homes. These are Bible-believing family of faith for whom we're supposed to be hospitable. In hindsight, I was surprised to go back even to look at the Apostle Paul when he commanded the churches in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 to take up an offering on the first day of the week. The purpose was to help believers who were suffering and were persecuted in a foreign land. But fast forward today, and in modern American Christianity, less than 1/4 of 1% of our collections is used to help the persecuted church. I'm not suggesting that it should be 100%, but the point is to make a huge shift in values and priorities. And so, again, I wrote the book, Heirloom Love, just to highlight the New Testament persecution context, but overlay a real practical application for today with stories of modern-day Christians who walk a normal Christian life that will encourage and inspire us in our walk as well. And so, so with the remaining time, I want to tell you more about the book and the ministry, but before I do, I want to transition and tell you about the other thing I wanted to share with you today, and that's a critical update on India. I was really surprised recently to learn that Hitler's Mein Kampf has been a bestseller in India. In hindsight, I shouldn't have been too surprised. In the last 3 years, India has leaped in ranking on the World Watch List from the 28th worst country to the 15th worst country for severe Christian persecution. And it's not a coincidence that 3 years ago, Narendra Modi was elected Prime Minister. Narendra Modi was elected Prime Minister. Modi and his Bharatiya Janata Party, known as the BJP, they're devout followers of Hindutva. Hindutva is a radical, highly politicized form of Hinduism that seeks to create a pure Hindu race, nation, and culture. And in doing so, they oppress and they severely persecute all religious minorities, but especially Christians and Muslims. Hindutva leaders are known for admiring Hitler. Hitler's Mein Kampf and his racial ideology inspired the Hindutva founding fathers in their pursuit of a pure Hindu race. The Hindutva patriarch Walker referred to the Nazi genocide as, and I quote, a good lesson for us to learn by. It's critical that we consider Modi and the BJP's past in order to understand and to plot India's trajectory for persecution in the future. Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat before he was elected prime minister. Gujarat, an Indian state with 62 million people, and when he was prime minister, the government's textbooks glorified Hitler and what they referred to as the achievements of Nazism. When Modi was prime minister, I'm sorry, my notes are out of order here. When Modi was prime minister, the U.S. State Department revoked his visa. He was banned from entering the United States because of his role in the 2002 Muslim genocide. At that time, Hindu nationalists brutally massacred over 1,000 Muslims and drove 100,000 more from their homes. After the attacks, the displaced people were relocated to state-run camps that reportedly, some of which didn't even have water and sanitation. Modi's administration refused to investigate the killings. They even defied a central government order to compensate the victims. They even withheld the victims' social welfare entitlements. Modi's administration was implicated in a massive cover-up for destroying evidence of the state's role in the violence. The India Human Rights Commission cited evidence that the killings were premeditated and that Modi and his government were complicit. To this day, Modi has not apologized or expressed even remorse for the killings. When Modi was chief minister, U.S. Congressman John Conyers and Joe Pitts called on the State Department to condemn Modi for repeated acts of violence against religious minorities. Congressman Conyers said, Mr. Modi has not been shy about proudly professing his anti-Christian and anti-Muslim stances, and he has actively sought to interfere in the practice of the Christian faith. Congressman Pitts said, the evidence is clear. Mr. Modi persecutes religious minorities. Our government should speak with one voice in condemning these policies and the actions of the Modi administration that has led to the death, torture, and imprisonment of thousands. Folks, that's Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy. And the ruling BJP party isn't any better. The worst violence to occur against Christians in India's history occurred under the BJP leadership. In 2008, Hindu nationalists in Orissa slaughtered more than 100 Christians, raped numerous women, destroyed 315 villages, and 4,640 homes. They demolished 252 churches. The police and armed forces that were sent to protect the Christians ignored their cries and allowed the massacre to continue unabated for almost 3 months. That's the BJP party. After the mayhem, one BJP leader was arrested and charged with 11 counts of murder. But he was convicted on only 1 count, and he was released after paying a small fine. The Indian Supreme Court overturned his release. But the state ignored the higher court ruling and reinstated the convicted murderer to his post in Parliament. So by now you're probably asking, why in the world did the Indian people elect him prime minister? The answer is simple, because he's good for the economy. Modi, when he was chief minister of Gujarat, had an incredible track record of economic success. He recruited hundreds of global companies to invest the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars in his state economy. But for us, looking back on Modi and the BJP gives us cause for great concern. And in his first 3 years as prime minister, he's validated that concern. The Hindutva founding fathers distrusted and were hostile toward non-governmental organizations, NGOs, especially Christian charities, because they considered them to be anti-national. So it wasn't surprising that after Modi became prime minister, his administration revoked the funding licenses of 10,000 NGOs. I didn't say 100 or even 1,000. 10,000 NGOs. That includes human rights groups, legal aid societies, and countless charities that are serving the millions of marginalized and impoverished people in India. In one example, a group in New Delhi called the Lawyers Collective, they had been providing free legal aid to minorities for 30 years. But in a recent case, they were representing the victims of the Muslim genocide that occurred under Modi's watch, and they were seeking to put Modi on trial for his role in the violence. Needless to say, after Modi became prime minister, their funding license was revoked. Or in another case that hits a little closer to home, consider Compassion International. You know, Compassion, the Christian charity that cares for the hundreds of thousands of India's destitute children. Modi became prime minister 3 years ago, and in the last 3 years, compassion has been the target of multiple coordinated governmental attacks because of their Christian faith. And finally, last year, their funding license was also revoked, and they are now in the process of withdrawing from India. Modi's Hindutva agenda was clearly seen again in 2015 when he and the BJP called for the enactment of a nationwide anti-conversion law. That law hasn't passed yet, but 7 Indian states encompassing 300 million people already have similar laws in place. These laws are used to harass and intimidate Hindus who want to change their faith. They also include fines and imprisonment for anyone who induces, whatever that means, induces a Hindu to change their faith. In reality, they're similar to the blasphemy laws. They're vaguely worded, and they're used to legally justify hostility and false imprisonment of Christians. And Modi's leadership team gives us great cause for concern. Amit Shah is the president of the BJP. He's also widely known to be Modi's right-hand man. Shah has a history of being entangled in legal controversies, including having been arrested for murder, kidnapping, and extortion. In the murder case, there was only one eyewitness, and that eyewitness was killed by the police. And Shah was a high-ranking official over the police division that killed the witness. Last month, Modi appointed a fiery Hindu cleric to lead as chief minister Uttar Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh is India's largest state with 200 million people. If it were a separate country, it would be the 5th largest country in the world. This radical cleric, whose name is Yogi Adityanath, has a history of being arrested for inciting violence against non-Hindus. According to the Hindustan Times, he's currently awaiting trial on charges of attempted murder, criminal intimidation, and rioting. This is the leader of 200 million people state in India. India's Electoral College will be voting for a new president in 3 months. The BJP is expected to appoint Mohan Bhagwat as their candidate for president. Bhagwat is currently the chief of the RSS. The RSS is the ideological mother of the Hindutva movement and the BJP. The RSS is widely known for their disdain of religious minorities and advocating even the forceful conversion of non-Hindus. This is India's leadership team. So it's not as much of a surprise to see that India has leaped in the ranking on the World Watch list in the 3 years that Modi's been chief minister from 28 to 15. And the outlook isn't good. So what can we do about it? Well, number one is ask you to pray. But be careful what you pray. I prayed, Lord, do something, and I believe he impressed on me Proverbs 31, 8 and 9. Proverbs 31, 8 and 9 says, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and needy. In other words, I believe God said, well, you do that, right? Amen. And so exactly today, 30 days to the day, on March 19th, I resigned from my corporate software world job vocation in order to pursue being a full-time voice and an advocate for our brothers and sisters who have no voice. I started an organization called Mute No More. You might say, Mute No More. Where'd that come from? Well, Mute No More is my story. It's about me opening my mouth for the mute. But Mute No More can be your story. It can be about you remembering the persecuted and lifting your voice for those who have no voice. But Mute No More is also about our persecuted brothers and sisters' story, because we are their God-appointed voice. So I would encourage you, go to our website, mutenomore.com, We present the latest in persecution news. We have a video library where you can meet our brothers and sisters and hear their testimonies firsthand of what life is like, a normal Christian life is like in many parts of the world. And it'll move and change you. We have a blog. The things I just shared with you today and the update on India are from my blog. And for those of you who like to go back and read the sources in that blog, you'll find links to all the sources confirming the information that I've shared with you today. And I would encourage you that if you're moved by what we shared today, I'd like to, before you leave, ask you to sign up on a sign-up sheet, and we can put you down to receive email news and updates, persecution news and updates going forward in the future. And for those of you who are watching online, you can go to mutenomore.com and sign up as well. We are in the early stages of planning an advocacy program to lift a unified voice on behalf of our brothers and sisters in India, more preemptive, more proactive, as opposed to waiting and it becomes reactive. And so if you'll sign up at mutenomore.com for updates, you can get updates on our advocacy program, and as the Lord leads you, hopefully participate. What else can you do? I would ask you, take the link. FRC graciously are going to post this online. Take the link and send it to 5 or 10 of your friends and tell them there's an important update for them on the body of Christ and their needs and what's happening in the news in India. You can buy a copy of Heirloom Love on Amazon.com, and you can go to our website, heirloomlove.com as well, and we offer quantity discounts for anybody that want to buy more than a few copies. I'd ask you, are there any questions?
This wonderful talk is kind of shocking, and I'm kind of reeling from all the stunning information. Maybe on a lighter note, I was wondering if you could, because I've read a little bit of the book, basically online on Amazon, but I wonder if you might talk about the cover and the color and the heirloom and where that comes from, is using it as a metaphor, because I think it has a very powerful part. It's part of your story that I think sort of was really a nice way of explaining what you're about.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so Heirloom Love is a study of what I call the legendary love of the first century church that changed the world. People came to Christ at a time when following Jesus could cost them everything. And so I take, hence the term heirloom love, and I take that and use the metaphor of the heirloom tomato. And for those of you that may be tomato fans, you know heirloom tomatoes are tomatoes that have not yet been genetically modified and engineered, where original tomatoes, God's tomatoes, were actually quite unattractive in color, shape, and form, and squishy and damaged and bruised easily, but nothing tastes better. Today you go in the grocery store and we have these tomatoes that are picture perfect, round, firm, bright red, and they've lost their taste. I make the analogy that in today, in our modern Christian culture, that maybe through our programs and our engineering, we might have lost some of that distinctive flavor and taste that would bring people to want to come to Christ, even if it were going to cost them everything. And so I developed that analogy a little bit further in Heirloom Love, of comparing heirloom tomatoes to heirloom faith and heirloom Christianity. Thank you for asking.
So you speak about churches needing to give more. Is there a certain amount that you would say churches need to give, and to what are the you talked about India, but what are the certain causes right now? What are the certain things? There are certain things like water or just the practical needs. What are the things that Christians need to be focused on giving to right now?
Thank you. Great question. Although I'm not qualified to say how much anybody should give. I think I could speak to that in a general sense. What's really amazing is Americans give. They're generous. American Christians are generous and give an estimated more than $50 billion and more a year. And less than 1/4 of that goes to help persecuted Christians. If we were to double that, we would have an amazing impact. But perhaps more importantly to your question, when you take the realm of the total need of the persecuted church, and I'm just speaking kind of in a very broad level, it's not that great when you compare it to $50 billion. As a percentage of $50 billion, that need actually is relatively small. So it's not a big number that's really needed here. It's just that the denominator is so small. And so the other part of that in need, the UN had a press release last month that said they are experiencing the worst humanitarian crisis in the history of the UN, and they said there are an estimated 20 million people on the verge of starvation. And what was really interesting is they pointed out that it was all rooted in the source of conflict. They neglected to say the source of that conflict, but nonetheless, that is largely our brothers and sisters, Christians, and those that have been driven from Islamic forces in Nigeria, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and to a lesser extent, other places in Africa. And so the need has literally never been greater in the history of recorded time. And so there are some great organizations out there doing relief in those areas. And if you're interested and you want to see me afterwards, I'd be glad to talk to you or contact me afterwards based on your level of interest and maybe make some recommendations on specific organizations.
Can you explain a little bit more about the advocacy program that you're looking at doing in India? And then also, are you partnering with any other kinds of organizations in the work that you're doing?
Thank you. And so the intention is to partner. And so I have colleagues within the Religious Liberty Partnership that I'll be working with on that. So it's not something we would do alone. We're much more effective when we unify as one voice and unite our resources as well. But it's not developed far enough along yet that it would be fair for me to share details.
You touched on this a little bit, but I was just wondering if you could expound on it. Some is, we need to pay attention. This is such an important thing. I found that God really spoke that to my heart. I needed to do that, and I started signing up for alerts and things like that. Then when I did that, it can seem overwhelming at times, just because it's so prevalent internationally. And I was just wondering what advice you would give as one person on where do I start when I want to get involved.
It is overwhelming, and sometimes it can be depressing. I remember reaching a low where just feeling like I wasn't making a difference. And so I would encourage you, ask the Lord to give you a particular country, maybe even a region in that country, and just allow Him to burden you with specific needs and how to pray for people, His people in that area. And maybe you can find videos on our website for that region, for that country. You can find news on that country, because the more you come up to speed, the more effective your prayers are. It wasn't that long ago that Pakistan was considering passing a law that it was illegal to own a Bible. And if your focus is on Pakistan, you could be praying, oh God, that law wouldn't pass. Or if it's India, Lord, I pray that this national enactment of an anti-conversion law wouldn't pass. You can't pray for all things all the time. And so just allow the Lord to allow you to specialize in a particular area, and then really track with the news and pray accordingly for that area. Others?
Just want to make a point. There's when you make reference to the sort of the reintroduction and the devotion of people to Mein Kampf, there it is. In the newspapers, I mean, basically like today, I just want to make the point that there is an interesting set of story about a book that's just being published that indicates after this author gained access to some United Nations archives that had been closed for 70 years. And they were recently opened, and he was able to get access to them. That essentially the Western powers knew about the genocide of the Jews in great detail as early as the middle of 1942. And even though it's not clear, because when they opened the camps and everything, everyone was shocked, and no one really understood. It was clear nobody could have really comprehended this, but it didn't mean that they didn't there's been a real campaign of deception inside, the Western world about what they really knew, and apparently there were a number of intelligence sources that were getting out real details, real bits of hard information and intelligence about the camps, and all of this sort of really ramped up in 1942 with the Wannsee Conference in the beginning of the year, with the extermination of the Jews. And it doesn't necessarily mean you could do a lot about it, because we were fighting a war and we couldn't do a lot about a lot of things. But it's these things are very serious, and to sort of think about people reading Mein Kampf and it doesn't have an effect on you when you're sort of propagating it as a way to introduce the notion of racism, and sort of genocidal racism, is something that's extremely dangerous. I think that whole sort of aspect of the story and what's going on in India has certainly been incredibly enlightening here. So I just thank you for bringing that up. I wouldn't have known that. And then, this sort of story that I just suggested everybody kind of pay attention to their newspapers. I think it was in the UK, The Independent is where the story broke. But you'll find it pretty easily. This will be a big story for a long time. Yad Vashem in Israel has put out a statement about it too. So.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank Mr. Sputo for coming. Okay, I have an heirloom tomato story, so this will take one. Do you have a minute? Okay, so here's my story. So, I don't know, it was about 10, 15 years ago. I had a friend, I used to ride the bus every day, and somehow we got this notion that we would grow heirloom tomatoes. Like, she knew about them, and I said, I've never done this, so we bought these sort of like big hydroponic, these like tubs, and you sort of, you could put them outside, and you grow these things. And so we had a couple of these things going, and so we picked the types of seeds we wanted, and so we grew them. And so but we didn't anticipate being a farmer could be difficult even in the middle of Alexandria, Virginia, because one of the things that is really not very pleasant about being a farmer are squirrels, varmints, and birds. And so by the time we got through with the entire experiment, we had like 4 tomatoes to split between us, right? That hadn't been like picked apart. So I got my tomatoes and she got hers, and So my father happened to be visiting me one time, and at the time when the tomato payoff occurred. And so, it's like the exchange. And so he and I sat down and we sliced the tomatoes. We were at a table and we each bit into one of them. My father looked at me and said, "That was the best tomato I ever ate in my life." And it really was. So I think if that's what authentic Christianity is like, I think in a way it must be the same sort of thing. It's the best taste you'll ever have in your mouth. So so there we go. All right. And with that, we thank you for attending, and go grow some heirloom tomatoes and fight off the squirrels. Thank you very much.